Welcome to M&A Plus, the art after the deal, where integrators are the heroes. Today's episode is called Strategic Synergies, Mastering M&A Integration with Vidur. Today, we're excited to host Vidur Bhandari, most recently the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Value Creation at Shiseido. His roles include Chief Strategy Officer, Head of Transformation, and other senior corporate development roles. With a profound track record in leading transformation programs and M&A integrations, Vidur brings invaluable insights into achieving operational excellence and growth in the competitive landscape of global markets. Join us as we dive into the complexities of M&A integration, strategic value creation, and the nuances of managing cultural and digital transformations in mergers and acquisitions. So welcome to the show, Vidur.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. So one of the things that I'm really excited about having you on is you are an actual real integrator with tons of hands-on integration experience. So I interview a lot of people that kind of touch integration or they see different pieces of integration, but you are actually the one that's into all of the details on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really excited to actually dive in a little bit on that topic from somebody that does have that day-to-day experience. So thank you again for joining us. And the first question is related to kind of your early days. And I wanted to, let our audience know a little bit about your upbringing. Where did you grow up? Where did you start your career journey? And how did you end up in the M&A field?
Yeah, wow. That could be the whole podcast.
I know. So try to narrow it down a little bit, but
no. So I actually grew up in Mumbai, India, and I started my career out of college in technology. So I was a technologist. It's what I loved doing. I think inherent in that, I enjoyed problem-solving aspect of writing code. And so the first part of my career was various roles being a software engineer, first for a big tech company in IT services. Then I left to work for a startup because I think I had the itch to go build something with a dynamic, talented group of people. And then finally, I did some back to big company when the tech bubble, the original tech bubble burst in California, back to big tech, but on the medical devices side, which was like super interesting. After that, I went to grad school. I think grad school was motivated primarily from my startup days and working on all aspects of growing a business. And I think it fueled for me a desire to want to go formalize my education and get an MBA. And with that, I pivoted into management consulting. I think was also a natural progression of one, rounding out my MBA education and actually using the things you learned in real business problems and situations, but also that continued passion for problem solving, right? So what are the hard, hairy problems that companies deal with, and how can I be part of solving for those? Mm-hmm. In my consulting career, probably this latter half of my consulting career, I did some work in the M&A space, diligence, integrations. I led a big integration for a car rental company and an acquisition that they made, which is probably the largest sort of scale and scope integration I'd done in my consulting life. And then I left consulting in 2016. I left the partnership at the firm actually to go to Shiseido and, as you described, head up strategy and value creation first, and then a couple of years into my role, formally take on, the global head of M&A integration for the company.
Great. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like it when people have kind of a technical profession and then they combine it with business, and it always ends up being a good combination. So my next question is also kind of a loaded question, but maybe we can just stay a little high level at first. But with all of your extensive experience in global M&A integration, especially at Shiseido, could you share kind of your high level approach to integrating new acquisitions into an existing corporate structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are basically three pillars to it, in my view. The first is the people and the culture. I think you have to be very mindful and sensitive to, particularly in the acquired business, the people and their culture. And I'm not suggesting you like harmonize cultures and all of that. That's a whole different topic. But you have to have a sensitivity to that, right? So in that sense, I don't think there's a playbook, because every acquisition you make and every team you bring on is going to be a little bit different. The second pillar is, it's the most obvious, which is, where's the value, right? So when you do the diligence and you build an acquisition plan, you have a value capture thesis. You know what your synergies, where the synergies lie, revenue synergies and cost synergies. And you have to use that as a true north, because it's easy sometimes in an integration to, as you get, once the company's acquired, it's easy to like you'll have functions wanting to throw things into the integration. It's like, oh, well, how about, we integrate our R&D departments, or we integrate, the supply chain, or just to use, many areas of where you can integrate businesses. And you always have to come back to the question is like, well, what is the value delivery that we have committed to in this acquisition plan? Because that's the focus of the integration for the first 6, 12, 18 months. And frankly, anything beyond that, you're not doing it right, because it's no longer an integration. And I think the third thing is, oftentimes you'll hear people say, this is the third pillar of integration, is that, integration should be about the best of both worlds, right? And one of the things underneath that is that you have to be very clear about what it is you bought, right? So what is the value of this asset that you've acquired, the business, the technology, whatever it is, and how do you preserve that, right? But best of both worlds also means that what are the things that we can take from this and apply to the rest of our businesses, our portfolio, and where could those yield value? Because there may be things that are not part of the acquisition plan, but are just, as an example, the business you just brought really does D2C really well, right? And they do it better than any of our other businesses. Well, how do we take that learning and bring it into our business? And sometimes you recognize that at the time of an acquisition, because you say, we're acquiring this for know-how or knowledge, right? Sometimes you don't, and you just discover it. But it should be a pillar of the integration to capture what's coming in from the acquired world.
So what are some of the most challenging aspects of doing that? I mean, do you see a lot of those integration efforts, you see, okay, this is definitely going to be value if we integrate this. So do you see that successfully happen more often than not, or is it a challenge all the time?
I don't want to make it sound like that, I've always been successful and I never had any failures. But I think a lot of integrations I've worked on have been successful because we've been very clear at the start of what the priority opportunities are and what does that mean, and very transparent about them as well with both the acquired entity and the team. So when you stand up what's commonly known as the integration management office, and you set up this IMO and you've got the functional work streams, if you stay true to what are the value levers that you need to pull, and the prioritization of those levers, right? Because there are some things that can generate value, but they're not in your acquisition plan for the first year, as an example. Do you throw them in now because it's, we can do that? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you keep focused, on what needs to be delivered. Because the success, a lot of times, at the end of the day, the success of an integration many times is measured in the first 2 years of the acquisition. Because that's when whatever governance structure you have in place, but most often the board is looking at how does this acquisition perform for us, right? And it's really, in a way, tied to, well, what did we say we were going to deliver when we acquired the entity, and we built a plan around that. So you stay focused on the synergies. Some of them are going to be easier. Some of them are going to be harder. Like if you're doing a lot of back office synergies and accounting and IT, and those are hairy and hard. But as long as you're thoughtful, transparent, you keep people in mind, because people will, in a lot of these cases, people that get displaced, and you have to keep people in mind and respect and honor that talent, right? Even if they will be displaced, you're just more likely to have success in an integration. If you kick off an IMO and you've got people saying like, well, gosh, we could move, or we could integrate our transportation systems, and it's like really not part of your plan, you could say, well, that's a good idea. Let's put it in the parking lot, and we'll come back to it a year from now or 18 months from now when the important milestones have been hit. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but that's a big part of it, right? And while you're doing all of these things, staying sensitive to the people that got acquired and the culture of that organization, because any acquisition is scary, right? It's like, anytime anyone of us who's been in a company that got acquired, when I started my career at Kearney, it was owned by EDS. And I hadn't even started at the firm yet. It was owned by EDS, and EDS decided to sell it. Like, they didn't want to be in the consulting business anymore. And I hadn't even graduated yet, but I had an offer with the firm. And I thought, gee, what's going to happen? Who's going to buy it? And there were all these rumors in X firm is looking at it, Y firm. And I thought, well, if this firm buys it, then maybe they don't want any new consultants. And so there's even before I was part of the company, there's always going to be an anxiety amongst people, no matter which function they're in, as to what's going to happen. And then there's going to be people who are going to see the opportunity, because maybe they were this small standalone business. Now they're part of a bigger group, and it opens up more career development opportunities for them, as to move around in. So you just have to make sure you're aware and manage that in the process.
Okay, so I have two follow-up questions on everything that you said. The first one, I'm just wondering if there is, between the deal time and the integration time, are the synergies that are contemplated the same at integration time, or is it more likely that you find different synergies or new value creation ideas because the deal team doesn't necessarily know how everything's going to play out? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So do you see a disconnect between that? And the other question to that is, would you be someone that would be involved in the deal team or not? Or do you just get things from the deal team after the fact?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, because I've seen it done both ways, right? So I've seen companies where there's a deal team and there's an integration team. And when the deal closes, there's a handoff to the integration team. And they essentially get what was in the acquisition plan, and they're off to integrate it. In my role at Shiseido, we didn't set it up that way. And it was deliberate and purposeful in that you need a deal team, because just scanning through the opportunities in the marketplace, if you're a highly acquisitive company, right? And depending on your sector, of course, but in the beauty business, there are hundreds of brands, and just scanning through the marketplace, finding the right opportunities, having all those conversations with bankers, with founders, with investors, it takes time. Like it's not something you can do off the side of your desk on a Friday afternoon. But the way we had it set up was the M&A deal team and the M&A integration team, which was my responsibility, were locked at the hip, right? So we knew what was in the pipeline. We kind of knew when things were going to get a little bit more serious. And when we kicked off formal diligence, we were always part of the diligence team. And being part of the diligence team is valuable in two respects. One, you get to meet the leadership team on the other side, and you get to form relationships with them early on, right? Even before you close. And so much of what you do in a transformation or an integration, right, it's change and it's trust. Like if you've got the trust, it works really well. That doesn't happen overnight, right? You can't sort of show up and it probably won't happen over the course of diligence either, but it starts laying the foundation of, you know, and then you get a little bit more time between sign and close because you sign the deal and, you know, you have to go through all the closing procedures before you get to day one. So you get a little bit more time to do that. And then the second reason is you really get to understand where the value unlock is, right? Because you're part of the diligence, you're seeing what the assumptions are, you know, where we have more certainty in a synergy and where we think there's a synergy here, but we're not as certain, right? Because you don't know everything. And diligence moves so quickly, you can't know it. So you do both of those things. And then back to your first question of, do you find things as you go through an integration? Absolutely, right? Because you will find things that you didn't know and you uncovered. More times because the teams are now really talking to each other and, you know, working together, and suddenly they uncover things that, you know, you didn't really know in diligence, which is like handoffs across the wall a lot of times, right? And through that collaboration, you uncover new value. And then the decision you have to make is, I go back to like, do you activate and go after it now, keeping in mind the resources and people and what they have to work on? Or do you park it and come back to it, you know, 12 months from now, once you've got the initial set of priorities done? And a lot of times it helps because in a way, Synergies is a portfolio approach, right? So you've got, I'm making it up, right? Hey, we thought there was going to be 50 million in cost synergies in our supply chain. Turns out it's actually only 30 million. But now you have two more ideas to like close that gap and and get back to your synergy target, you know? So it helps in that respect as well when you find things. But those are all choices you have to make while you're integrating. Do I go after newfound synergies and over deliver, right? Which is always, everybody loves that. Do I use them to offset, you know, synergies that I may not be able to capture as quickly as I thought? Or do I just park them because the organization is already stretched too thin, right?
Yeah. So on the opposite side of that, so maybe it's not the case at your experience with Shiseido because they did have an integrated approach between the deal team and the integrator. But do you have any experience with what happens when you don't have that and the integrator finds negative value, like the value cannot be realized or it's not possible to be realized because this, and this?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. In consulting, you know, my experiences are more from consulting because sometimes in consulting, you weren't on the diligence team, right? You were brought in when the deal closed to lead the integration, and then you have to unpack, you know, all the synergies, and sometimes you find like some of it's just a bag of air, right? There's really nothing there. Or somebody took a very high level assumption, and it is back to that. I think what you were saying, and I have had that experience with a client where, you know, there was an assumption of a certain amount of synergies that they were going to get from the packaging. So it was a consumer brands business, and these synergies that they were going to unlock in packaging, and then equally these revenue synergies they were going to create because of the relationships they had with retailers and how they were going to expand distribution, right? In both of those areas, the synergies had been highly overestimated, right? Without a lot of like grounding in terms of, you know, as an example, is that hitting that level of sales with a retailer in year one even practical? You know, you can get product on shelf, but so in instances like that, it's part of either you go through a revision of plan, which again is getting alignment with the board or the senior stakeholders in terms of when synergies will hit and what that is, or which is more likely the case because nobody wants to not deliver in the first year. But what's more likely the case is you have to go find more synergies elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. So one more question on this topic, and then we'll move on to the contracts. But so I hear the phrase often in the news and in the M&A world that most M&As fail. So why do you think that people say most M&As fail all the time? And do you agree with that?
So I don't agree with it. I think the statement that's, and I've heard that statement as well, also sometimes attached with a percentage, like 70% of
Mm-hmm.
acquisitions don't deliver their value and so forth. And I'm sure there's some data off of which sometimes these statements are made, but I don't necessarily agree with it because I think statements like that are made for effect, right? It's like, oh my gosh, 8 times out of 10, it's some consulting firm that's making it because it's like, hey, you really need help to get value, and it's a business motivator. But I do agree with some part of it, and I'll tell you what parts I agree with. I think it's not so much the integration or the value capture that becomes a hurdle. It's
Mm-hmm.
what was put into the deal in the first place. So a lot of times you have CEOs who want to make that acquisition really badly, right? They're like, we want to buy
Mm-hmm.
that company, we want to buy that brand, we want to buy that technology. And the marketplace, in many ways, determines what the price of something is because there are multiples and there's a multiple gets traded on. And so you generally have a sense of like, you do as a buyer, the seller has a sense of like what they would like to get for their business. And then a lot of times you say, well, if you do the true like zero based, like here's all the synergies we can capture, here's how we deliver, and you build it all up, and you don't get to that number, but you really want the deal, then you start like, inflating some areas, right? You start saying,
Mm-hmm.
well, like actually, maybe we should be more aggressive on our international revenue synergies, or maybe we should be more aggressive in the cost synergies we can capture on IT, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to get to here's the price that, we can get the deal done at. And that's when you're setting yourself up for quote unquote failure, because then
Mm-hmm.
capturing that value on the back end becomes an impossible task for the organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the value capture takes longer. In some cases, depending on how you account for acquisitions, you may have to do write-offs.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes companies that buy a lot of brands and are again grow through acquisitions, it all sort of rolls into the other. So there's no way to like separately
Mm-hmm.
track which ones paid off well and which ones didn't pay off as well. And so overall, they look successful as as an acquirer over a horizon of time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that to me is probably a reason things fail, right? And do integrations stumble? Yes, of course, integrations also stumble
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. And it's not, even if you did, your synergies were realistic and all of that, then executing them because you didn't mobilize the right resources, you didn't mobilize the teams. One of the
Mm-hmm.
hurdles, quite honestly, I find is, again, more from my consulting career, is your integration team was 80% in the buying company, right? So the big strategic, they're running the integration. What's way more effective is when you have collaborative teams between the
Mm-hmm.
acquired and the
Mm-hmm.
acquiree, because the
Yeah.
ability to capture synergies is much more effective.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires, again, it requires a level of transparency, it requires a level of trust,
Mm-hmm.
it requires communication and a
Mm-hmm.
people focus, that's important. But sometimes, sometimes companies don't do that. They say like, well,
Yeah.
we bought them. This is how we're doing it.
Yeah.
Then that can fail as well.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that. I mean, I've been thrust into different types of environments, and the more collaborative they are, the better. I mean, it's just like night and day working with a collaborative team. Of course, we're focused on the contract review part, which is my next question, actually. So I did want to ask you kind of in general, and this is really getting into nitty gritty. It's because that's what my company does. But I want to ask you how important and to what extent and at what phase in the M&A process do contracts need to be reviewed, and to how much detail, because we've run into situations where there was a $4 billion M&A deal done and the customer contracts weren't reviewed at all because they were too hard to access. And there were rebate clauses all over the place in them that nobody knew about. And it impacted the value, of course. So, but I'm just wondering, from your experience and from your point of view, when it comes to the actual customer contract reviews and the supplier contract reviews, how important is that to the value creation? And at what point, and I guess to what level of review? Because I mean, some companies have 20,000 agreements. You can't necessarily review everything, right? But to what extent does it become important?
Yes, you can't review everything. I think with both of those things, on the customer side and on the vendor side, right, supplier or vendor side, you have to prioritize what you're going to look at, right? So customer contracts, 100% you need to look at, because those are the terms that you're going to inherit, right? And there also shouldn't, again, it'll vary by industry, but there shouldn't be an assumption that, okay, well, our terms are better and we're just going to harmonize everything, because, guess what? Like retailers, like in our business, retailers don't agree to that, right? Even so, back to your question about how important is it for understanding the value, like I think you have to temper that, right? It's more important to do it in all contracts. It's more important to do it, I think, during diligence to minimize your risk. Like that should be the first objective. And of course, this, as a secondary objective, then are there any levers for value capture in customer or vendor contracts? But risk to me is the number one reason you should.
Okay.
And then on the vendor contracts, equally, you need to look at, because we've had sometimes, I've been in deals where, like, probably not as nightmarish as yours, where like none of but you're in contracts we've had distributor contracts that were in perpetuity. Like the contract is literally in perpetuity with just an exit. Not that there wasn't an exit clause, but an exit clause that's almost impossible to do while managing a reasonable business transition, right? So if you wanted to exit this distributor, go to a different one, like it's just no way to do it without business disruption. So those are the types of things you need to know before you close, because that's the assumption of risk, right? And it's not to say like it should be a deal breaker, but it's just understanding like how you're going to manage. And then on the vendor side,
it might impact the price, or the purchase price too, right?
Of course, 100%. Like, because if you think like, and because you won't attribute synergies where there are none, right? And equally, if there are dyssynergies, because we've talked a lot about synergies, but sometimes you have to factor in dyssynergies. You want to make sure that that's captured as well, that you've got somewhere where you're accounting for, a cost of harmonizing businesses or harmonizing the acquired net. So I would say that's probably the most important thing. And then there's a separate consideration of whether you're buying an entity, a legal entity, or you're buying, an asset. Is it an asset deal or an entity deal? Because in an entity deal, like all those contracts transfer over, right? But in an asset deal, you can't assume that all the contracts will convey, because depending on what the contract says, the customer or the vendor may have a choice to like separate, right? So sometimes contracts have that. They say like if there's a change in ownership, or so if you're doing an asset deal, then that becomes important to understand as well.
Yeah, those are the ones we're involved with the most of the time because of the separation complexity that comes with buying a piece of a company. So that brings me to my next question, because I know that you have a lot of experience with those transition services agreements. And I talk about them as the twilight zone of TSAs, because there's always this TSA period, and it's very difficult to work through that period, especially as time goes on. Everybody wants to get off the TSAs, but it's very difficult because it requires a lot of effort, and strategy needs to be set and all these things, and there's never enough time. And those are some of our experiences with that. But I wanted to ask you, kind of in managing those carve-outs and divestiture processes, how do you handle the complexities of the contract transition and the TSAs. And I guess one of the questions would be, what's important to cover in a TSA from your experience?
It's another great question. And I'm not sure there's an easy answer to this because for all the reasons you outlined, TSAs are inherently complicated things, because on the face of it, it's a services agreement where one entity is providing services to another entity for a defined period of time and at a defined cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain service levels, right, that you have to outline. So the general framework of a TSA is well understood, and you have to outline these. What makes TSAs complicated is, one, a lot of times the buyer will want a TSA that's longer than the seller wants to give, right? Because it's,
Mm-hmm.
as you were saying, you want to, if you've sold something, if you've carved out something, you want to move on. You want to,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, that's done, that chapter's closed, and I want to move on. And a TSA is just an extension of what in a complete entity deal would be closed, right? So day one, everybody's separate and we're off. But
Mm-hmm.
it's an extension. So you have sort of two separations, right? You have separation one, which is when you close the deal on day one. And then you have the second separation, which is when you exit the TSA. And if you have multiple TSAs, then you have multiple exit. So that's usually the first source of contention, is how long is this thing going to be, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think you don't want to push it too hard to be short, because if short is unrealistic, then it's only going to end up getting extended. And there are ways, of
Mm-hmm.
course, in TSAs to have extension clauses, and there's an escalation of price to make sure there's a disincentive to
Mm-hmm.
extend, blah, blah, blah. But also it's unrealistic, right? Because the more important thing is you have to know how long you need to provide those services for and get the exited. Because chances are that the people, the resources, sometimes the technology platforms that may be unique to this, or your licenses, even if it's a shared platform, all of that's tied to providing these services. So for your own planning of when you're going to exit those and be
Mm-hmm.
able to reduce your footprint, right, in IT, in other shared services, is tied to that TSA duration. And so knowing like, okay, if we said 9 months and that's it's going to be 9 months, it allows you to plan on your end as well. So that's the first thing, the timing. And then the second thing is, while yes, you write in SLAs and this, that, and the other, like any contract, right? And that's why good contracts are hard to write, is you have to really think about not the end fringe cases of what might happen, but just the everyday business operations and what might go wrong or where points of friction may arise, and make sure that the TSA covers for those scenarios. Because what happens when it doesn't is that there's nothing to refer to. So you're 3 months into a TSA and something, maybe your TSA is on transportation logistics, and like a truck gets delayed, and the buyer says, well, I missed this delivery and now I'm out of stock and I have lost sales of X, and you owe me the lost revenue. And the TSA doesn't say anything about any of those things. And so, I mean, I'm giving a very obvious example, but there are things like that. And thinking through all of the business scenarios without overthinking them, because I've seen the other extreme too, where you're in just rounds and rounds between the legal teams, because somebody on the other side of the legal team came up with some hypothetical scenario which is not really plausibly going to play out, but now wants to, and that's a waste of everybody's time too, and is only helping billable hours for your law firms, right? But you have to find the balance. They can't be super high level and say, okay, it's it's just a service agreement, and here's the services we're providing, and here's the SLAs for these different services, or KPIs if you have them. It also has to cover, at least the more likely things that that could happen
Mm-hmm.
in normal business operations, and have some kind of resolution around that, right? Because, well, if you're clear about all those things, then if something does happen, you can go back and reference the TSA. And
Right.
after I've said all of that, the TSA governance, because you didn't ask about governance, but the governance of TSAs, once they're all written and signed and everything, is super important, because
Mm-hmm.
you're not gonna cover everything. It's
Mm-hmm.
the reality of, you're not gonna catch everything. Things are gonna happen, and you're gonna have to address it in real time and find a way to negotiate and defend and find sort of solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you're in the service period.
Good. Well, I love all this information. This is really interesting. I know we're kind of getting up on time here, but I want to ask you another question before we start to do our closing thoughts, which is related to digital transformation. So, how do you believe digital innovation plays into the integration process?
Oh, into the integration process. So there's two obvious ways, right? Or they're not obvious, but there's two ways. One is, if, again, part of the value of what you're acquiring is in the company's digital capabilities, then it becomes a priority. Or the reverse, if part of your synergy goals are tied to your digital capabilities, then it becomes a priority in how quickly you integrate those two things, right? If it's not, like, you don't touch it, like we said. But the other thing, which I don't think, so I haven't deployed yet, but I expect we're going to start to see more of now, is the ability for integration management offices, the IMOs, to use more digital tools in an integration. And there have been digital tools for a long time, but I think they're more around the classic, synergy tracking and
Mm-hmm.
project milestones and all of the sort of fundamental things. But I'm thinking of capabilities that, you raise the question of how do you even go through, 20,000 contracts or whatever during diligence. Well, like,
Mm-hmm.
gee, I don't know, like, now we have Gen AI capabilities, and is there a way, do we have digital tools then that allow us to more quickly do those types of reviews and get to the things that matter to flag risks or synergy opportunities in contracts, right? Are there ways in which we can use, digital platforms to risk, not risk, but sensitivity and pressure test, synergy assumptions that we're doing? I think we've yet to see those capabilities in place, or at least I haven't seen them, in
Mm-hmm.
my experience. They might be out there. I'm not saying they
Mm-hmm.
aren't. The digital tools I've seen are more I would call them more the classic. They've been around for like a decade. They've gotten better,
Mm-hmm.
right? They help you kind of
Yeah.
manage an IMO and track synergies and do pretty dashboards and make sure things are on track, and simplify a lot of that tracking and reporting.
Right. We actually do work with a partner that we've spent a lot of time vetting who we want to do that activity, because there's a lot of tools out there that don't really work, or they don't say, or can't really handle the capacity that you want it to, or it doesn't really do a good job. We do work with one that we trust more, and we would probably say it helps us, with 80% of the review. I mean, that's actually a
Yeah,
lot. If you're talking about
that's
putting things, segmenting, different terms or things like that. So it does help our team narrow down the level of effort that reduce down the level of effort that it would actually take to review everything. Of course. So
right.
yeah,
And then
that's
it
actually
probably
a good
helps
point.
you.
Yeah.
It probably helps you sort of zero in on, like, okay, here's the 30 contracts that we absolutely have to, like, take
Yes.
a closer look at.
Mm-hmm.
So the expert view,
Mm-hmm.
right, or review is more focused, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's huge. Yeah,
And you
that's
make
huge.
a good point on that. There's no reason why today that can't be done. And it could be done with all the contracts, actually, because it's
Yeah,
not so hard to do anymore. It's not as hard to do. It doesn't take as much time.
Yeah, probably
You could do,
I was sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think probably
no,
the
it's
bigger
okay.
effort there would be just, and whether we could spend a whole podcast on this, is getting all the
Hmm.
contracts in one place. Because
Yeah,
like a lot of the
that's
companies
probably,
don't.
hmm,
A lot of companies, even ones which have contract management systems and things in place,
hmm,
like don't always have, you know, sometimes like your key customer contracts are not even in that. So it's
hmm.
yeah. So there's
Yeah,
probably like a
it
little bit of
does matter
upfront
what you
effort.
put in there, because sometimes you come up with documents and there's, 12 amendments, the last amendments are missing, or a few of the amendments are missing. So you don't actually really know what the terms are if that's the case. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah, yeah,
definitely still human, sort of organizing that needs to go on. But if you did have a data set and documents that were complete, you could run them through a tool like that, and it would be really quick to find some key terms. So yeah, it's gotten a lot better, I guess, than it was like 5 years ago. I mean,
yeah.
the quality of it today is better than it was 5 years ago. And my company's been around, 8 or 9 years, and we've been trying to do it, and we've only been able to do it, successfully and in a way that makes sense for our customers in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I bet you in this time next year you'll be even better at it. By
Mm-hmm.
like an expert, because I think that's just also the way these technologies evolve, right? Sometimes it's just a
Mm-hmm.
long time for them, and then there's a inflection point like we're having right now that then help really
Mm-hmm.
accelerate the quality of what's being done, and then it plateaus out again because maybe you reach the peak of what's possible, right? Until the next big innovation allows another inflection point.
Right. Yeah, it's exciting. Okay, good. Well, I wanted to also give you a chance just to talk about any final words you have in general about integration, and let us know where we can get in touch with you, where we can contact you if
Well,
anybody
I think
wants to contact you.
LinkedIn is, probably the best way. I'm on LinkedIn and my profile is open and you can connect, message. I think my sort of final thoughts on this are I've done a lot of things in my career, right? As I think you mentioned at the beginning of the call, and the integration, divestiture, M&A piece of it is probably only one half of the hat that I've worn on leadership teams. Integrations are always more exciting than divestitures because, you know,
Mhm.
you're buying something new and everyone's excited about it, and divestitures are sad and painful, but I think they're both equally complicated and require a different approach and mindset. But I will say that they both involve people, and it's probably the thing that a lot of times is said, right? Like, oh, people are important, but not action always. And
Mhm.
and I think it's important to make sure that everything that's being done has that element of connecting and bringing people along in that
Mhm.
process.
Right.
Because that a lot of times is what puts you on the success or failure side of the line.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good point and a good closing. The people are the most important. They always are, always. So thank you, Vidur, for sharing your expertise and real world experiences with us. It's been enlightening to learn about the strategic depth involved in M&A integration and the critical role of leadership in navigating these complex processes. So for our listeners looking to dive deeper into Vidur's work, look for Vidur Bhandari on LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in to M&A Plus, the art after the deal. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and join us next time as we continue to explore the intricate world of mergers and acquisitions. Until then, keep striving for excellence in every deal.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you.